October 2019, Lancaster County, Nebraska. A demolition crew was clearing the skeletal remains of the old brown farm when they encountered an obstacle. A 6-foot-tall rear wheel from a John Deere tractor lay flat on the dirt floor of a collapsing barn, a monument to decay. It was impossibly heavy. A worker, aiming to drain what he assumed was liquid ballast, brought a reciprocating saw to the thick rubber. The blade bit in, whined, and then struck something solid with a sickening, organic thud. Prying back the severed tread revealed not water, but a solid mass of hardened soil, dried lime, and woven into it, the complete, articulated skeleton of a man. At that precise moment, under the indifferent Nebraska sky, the cold case of Bobby Ray Henderson, a farmer who had vanished from the face of the earth in the summer of 1999, was violently torn open. August of 1999 was not a month for forgiveness in Lancaster County. A blistering heat wave had baked the land for weeks, turning proud fields of corn into brittle, yellowed skeletons. The earth itself was cracked and gasping. In the midst of this agricultural siege was Bobby Ray Henderson, 34 years old, a man whose ambition burned hotter than the sun. He had recently inherited the family farm and saw not ruin, but opportunity. He spoke of new irrigation techniques, of drought-resistant seeds, of a future secured by science, not just prayer. His neighbors, men who farmed the same way their fathers and grandfathers had, saw his talk as arrogance. They watched his new equipment roll onto his property with a mixture of suspicion and resentment. None watched more closely than Cletus Brown, a man in his mid-60s whose knuckles were as hard as his beliefs. He believed in tradition, in the old ways, and saw Henderson's modern approach as a personal affront, a dismissal of a lifetime spent working the soil. Their properties were divided by a dusty service road and a creek that was now little more than a muddy scar. On the morning of his disappearance, Bobby Ray had coffee with his wife, laying out his plans for the day. The conversation, like every conversation that summer, was about water. He was worried about the pump for the main well and mentioned he was going to drive to the far boundary of his property, where the creek trickled out of Cletus Brown's land. He'd said it seemed to be drying up faster than it should, even for a drought this severe. It was a problem he intended to solve, like any other. He left the house just after 10 a.m., the heat already shimmering off the dirt roads. He told his wife he wouldn't be long, just a quick survey of the fence line and the creek bed. He climbed into his Ford F-150, a vehicle as reliable and unassuming as the man who drove it. He tossed his wallet onto the dashboard next to a map of the property lines. A half-full bottle of water sat in the cup holder, sweating in the oppressive cabin heat. He started the engine, the familiar rumble a small defiance against the crushing silence of the drought-stricken landscape. He drove down the service road that separated his land from Cletus Brown's, a line drawn in the dust. The engine noise faded into the August haze, and then there was only silence. A profound and absolute silence that would swallow a man whole and last for 20 years. The demolition site was frozen, transformed in an instant from a place of destruction to one of painstaking reconstruction. The Lancaster County Sheriff's Office secured the perimeter, their modern vehicles looking alien against the weathered wood of the collapsing barn. Among the first to arrive was Detective Frank Miller. He was a veteran now, his face a map of long winters and difficult cases, but in 1999 he had been a young deputy who walked these same fields, calling Bobby Ray Henderson's name until his throat was raw. For him, this wasn't a new case. It was a ghost stepping out of the earth. The forensic team treated the giant wheel not as a container, but as a stratified archaeological site. They worked under powerful floodlights, meticulously removing the compacted mixture of soil and lime, spoonful by spoonful. Every particle was sifted, every fragment labeled and bagged. It was a slow, grueling process of exhuming a man from his own bizarre rubber sarcophagus. The air was thick with the dust of 2 decades of silence. The initial findings came in a series of clipped professional reports. The remains were those of an adult male, consistent with Henderson's age and height. Remnants of denim jeans and the leather of work boots had survived the accelerated decomposition, a ghostly outline of the man he once was. Then came the definitive link, a silver belt buckle, tarnished but unmistakable, engraved with the initials B.R.H. The identification was positive. The county coroner confirmed a depressed fracture on the left temporal bone of the skull, a single catastrophic blow. This was not an accident. This was a homicide. The discovery immediately raised a new set of urgent questions, questions that were impossible to answer 20 years prior. First, the lime. Why use agricultural lime in such quantities? The answer was chillingly practical: to speed up the decay of soft tissue and, more importantly, to neutralize the odor of decomposition. It spoke of a grim, farm-bred knowledge. Second, the wheel itself. Who had the means and the strength to not only move a 600-pound wheel, but to meticulously pack it with soil and a body? The logistics of the concealment were staggering. And then there was the most haunting detail of all: the small pair of wire-cutting pliers rusted into the bones of Bobby Ray Henderson's right hand. He had died clutching them. It was a piece of the puzzle that didn't fit, a final, silent statement from the victim himself. Why the pliers? What fence was so important that it became the final act of a man's life? This was not a spontaneous crime of passion that ended in a panicked burial. The murder itself may have been swift, but the cover-up was an operation. It was a project, requiring time, forethought, and a profound coldness. To fill that wheel, to seal it with the body of a neighbor, and to leave it in a barn for 20 years was an act of calculated, patient evil. The search for a missing person was over. The hunt for a killer had just begun. To understand the genius of the crime, one must first understand the failure of the original investigation. In the August heat of 1999, the search for Bobby Ray Henderson was a portrait of futility. Hundreds of volunteers and law enforcement officers walked grid patterns through miles of cornfields, their heads bowed against the sun, the rustling stalks seeming to mock their efforts. Helicopters saw nothing but a uniform sea of green and yellow. The farm was vast, the landscape indifferent. It was the perfect place to make a man disappear. With no body and no physical evidence at the scene, investigators were forced to chase theories. They considered a gruesome farming accident, the possibility that Henderson had been caught in a piece of machinery, but a forensic sweep of his equipment yielded nothing. They briefly pursued the idea that he had walked away from his life, a common theory in disappearance cases. Yet a thorough review of his finances showed a man investing heavily in his future, not running from his past. He had debt, but it was the calculated debt of ambition, not the panicked debt of desperation. The real obstacle, however, was not the landscape, it was the people in it. When deputies interviewed the neighboring farmers, they were met with a wall of quiet, stoic resistance. The answers were clipped, non-committal. The drought was hard on everyone. People were on edge. Bobby Ray was ambitious. The word was always delivered with a slight, knowing pause. When a young Deputy Frank Miller questioned Cletus Brown, the man was openly hostile, barely looking up from the engine he was fixing. He spat on the ground and said Henderson was a fool who didn't know the land. It was dismissed as the grumblings of an old traditionalist, nothing more. It was in this environment of suspicion and non-cooperation that the theory of the fired farmhand took root. The man had a motive, revenge for being fired over fuel theft, and he had conveniently left the state. The community, perhaps eager for a simple answer that didn't involve looking at their own, began to whisper his name. For an overstretched sheriff's office, he was the perfect suspect, an outsider with a grudge who was no longer around to question. The focus of the investigation shifted, diverting precious time and resources to tracking a ghost. The silence that fell over Lancaster County in 1999 was not merely an absence of information. It was an active force. It was a collective agreement to look away, to favor the convenient lie over the uncomfortable truth. It was a form of complicity, a quiet conspiracy of shrugs and whispers that allowed a murder to be reclassified as a mystery. This wall of silence provided the perfect cover, allowing the real crime and its victim to be packed away in a barn, hidden not in a remote grave, but in plain sight. Detective Miller's new investigation began with the ghosts of Lancaster County. His team revisited the farmhouses they had visited 20 years before, but now they were speaking to the elderly, to people whose memories were landscapes worn smooth by time. The wall of silence had crumbled, replaced by a fog of uncertainty. Men who had been Cletus Brown's peers now sat in worn armchairs, their hands trembling slightly as they tried to recall the tensions of that blistering summer. They remembered the arguments over water. Everyone did. It was the lifeblood of their world. But the details were gone, blurred into a general narrative of hardship and bad blood. Recollections, softened by 2 decades, were a tapestry of half-truths and faded resentments. One neighbor recalled seeing Bobby Ray's truck by the service road that day, but couldn't be sure of the time. Another remembered Cletus being in a foul temper for weeks, but that was nothing new. They spoke of Martha Brown, Cletus's wife, a woman who seemed to shrink with each passing year. They described her as a bird trapped in a cage, terrified of her husband's shadow. She had died in 2012, taking whatever secrets she held to the grave. The interviews provided atmosphere, a portrait of a simmering conflict, but they offered no hard facts. The ghosts were whispering, but not clearly. Frustrated by the haze of human memory, Miller turned his team's focus to a witness that never forgets: paper. They submerged themselves in the county archives, in dusty boxes filled with the mundane transactions that form the bedrock of a life. They pulled property deeds, tax assessments, bank statements, and most importantly, records from the local agricultural supply co-op. They were not looking for a confession. They were looking for a single, anomalous detail that deviated from the rhythm of a farmer's life. For weeks, the search yielded nothing but the predictable patterns of a traditional farm. Cletus Brown bought the same seed, the same fertilizer, the same machine parts, year after year. He was a man of rigid routine. His records were a testament to a life lived without deviation. The work was tedious, a slow erosion of hope. The investigators waded through invoices for baling twine, motor oil, and cattle feed. The ink faded, the paper brittle with age. Then, a young analyst flagged a single receipt. It was from the farm co-op, dated just 2 days after Bobby Ray Henderson was last seen. The purchase was small, almost insignificant in the grand ledger of farm expenses. It wasn't for fuel, it wasn't for seed, it was for 2 50-pound bags of hydrated lime. The team immediately cross-referenced the purchase with Cletus Brown's own farm logs and county agricultural records. He had not been preparing his fields for a new season. The drought had rendered them barren. There was no order for soil treatment, no plan to adjust the pH of his land. The purchase had no agricultural purpose. In the context of a man found buried in lime, that single forgotten invoice was not a transaction. It was a confession written in carbon copy. Even with the chilling discovery of the lime purchase, professional diligence demanded that every old lead be pursued to its absolute conclusion. And the thickest file from 1999 concerned a man named Earl Simmons. The farmhand Bobby Ray Henderson had fired for theft a month before he vanished. Simmons had made threats. He had a temper. And he had left Nebraska within weeks of the disappearance. In the original case file, he was not just a suspect. He was the entire theory. For the community and the original investigators, he was the convenient answer, the angry outsider who brought violence to their quiet corner of the world. For a time, the new investigation followed this old ghost. It was a compelling narrative, a heated argument in a remote field, a single blow struck in anger, followed by a panicked flight across state lines. The brutality of the murder fit the profile of a man lashing out in a fit of rage. Detective Miller's team devoted its full resources to a modern manhunt, using digital tools the 1999 deputies could only have dreamed of. They tracked social security numbers, cross-referenced public records, and built a 20-year map of a man's life. The trail led them through 3 states and 2 failed businesses. The viewer, along with the investigators, could feel the net tightening. They finally located Earl Simmons not in a fugitive hideout, but in a modest suburban home in Eugene, Oregon. When 2 plainclothes detectives approached him, they found not a hardened killer, but a 68-year-old grandfather tending to his rose bushes. He was quiet, cooperative, and when he heard why they had come, he simply sighed, a sound of weary resignation. He had, it turned out, been living with this shadow for 2 decades. The theory collapsed not with a bang, but with the quiet presentation of a photo album. For the entire week of Bobby Ray Henderson's disappearance, Earl Simmons and his family had been on a pre-planned vacation to Grand Teton National Park. He provided credit card receipts from gas stations in Wyoming, dated photographs of his young children by a lake, and a signed guest register from a motel in Jackson. The alibi was not just airtight. It was a fortress, a simple, verifiable truth that the original, overstretched investigators had never managed to confirm. The path that had seemed so promising led to an absolute dead end. But the detour was not a failure. It was a necessary exorcism. By proving Earl Simmons's innocence, the investigation cleared away the fog of convenient speculation that had shrouded the case for 20 years. It closed the door on the easy answer and forced Detective Miller to turn his gaze back towards Lancaster County, back to the simmering resentments between neighbors, back to a dusty service road, and back to a fundamental conflict over the one thing more valuable than land: water. With the false trail of Earl Simmons grown cold, the investigation had stalled. Detective Miller was left with a collection of potent but circumstantial facts: a body, a fractured skull, a receipt for lime, and a pair of rusted wire cutters. He had the how, but the why remained locked in the past, buried with a man who could no longer speak, and guarded by the silence of a woman long dead. The search turned back to the archives, this time focusing on the years after the murder, looking for any ripple, any echo of the crime in the lives of Cletus and Martha Brown. For weeks, they found nothing. Then came the anomaly. A county clerk, reviewing property transfers, flagged a minor transaction from 2010. Martha Brown, shortly after her husband was permanently moved into a state-run nursing home, had donated a small, oddly shaped parcel of their land to a local church. The plot was less than 1/4 of an acre, landlocked and agriculturally useless. It was a meaningless gesture on the surface, a small charitable act from a new widow. But when Miller mapped the coordinates, his focus sharpened. The donated land contained nothing of value except for one thing: the precise location of the dried-up creek bed that had separated the Henderson and Brown properties. The paper trail led Miller to a quiet, immaculate house in a neighboring town, the home of Martha Brown's younger sister. She was an elderly woman who spoke of Martha with a sad reverence, describing her as a devout and gentle soul who had been slowly erased by her husband's harshness. Miller listened patiently, letting the silence in the room do the work for him. Finally, he asked about the land donation. The sister's eyes filled with tears. She explained it had been one of Martha's final wishes, something that had weighed on her mind during her last days. And then, she delivered the words that broke the case wide open. She recounted her sister's deathbed confession, a cryptic, whispered plea for absolution. Martha had clutched her hand and said, "I just wanted the land to be clean again. Cletus buried his sin in the dirt, but God knows where the water stopped." For the sister, It was the rambling of a dying woman. For Detective Miller, it was a Rosetta Stone. In that single moment, 20 years of silence shattered. Where the water stopped, it wasn't a metaphor. It was a place. It was the illegal earthen dam Cletus had built to steal the last of the creek's water for himself. The wire cutters in Bobby Ray's hand, he had cut through the fence to confront Cletus about it. Cletus buried his sin in the dirt, not in a grave dug in the ground, but in a tractor wheel filled with dirt from the very land he was trying to protect. The whole ugly picture snapped into focus with brutal clarity. This wasn't about abstract ambition or simmering resentment. It was about the most fundamental thing in a drought: water. Bobby Ray Henderson hadn't stumbled into a random act of violence. He had discovered a crime in progress and paid for it with his life. Martha Brown, too terrified to speak the truth aloud, had tried to atone in the only way she could, by giving away the tainted land, the scene of the crime's origin. The evidence had been there all along, not in a hidden diary, but in a public record and a grieving sister's memory. Based on the evidence unearthed 2 decades later, the last hour of Bobby Ray Henderson's life can be reconstructed with chilling precision. The story begins and ends with water. On that scorching August morning, convinced the creek was not failing but being deliberately starved, Bobby Ray drove his truck to the edge of his property. He found what he was looking for: a section of barbed wire fence between his land and Cletus Brown's that showed signs of recent tampering. He grabbed a pair of wire cutters from his toolbox, a simple tool for a simple job, and snipped his way through. He walked across the cracked earth, following the ghost of the creek bed onto his neighbor's land. And there it was, a crude but effective earthen dam, hastily built to divert the last precious trickle of water to Cletus's own withering crops. It was an act of profound betrayal, a theft of the single most vital resource in that unforgiving summer. At that moment, Cletus Brown emerged, perhaps from behind a piece of machinery where he'd been working. He was caught. There were no pleasantries, only the raw, unfiltered anger of 2 desperate men under a punishing sun. The argument was not just about water. It was the culmination of years of simmering resentment. It was the old way versus the new. It was a clash of pride and progress, fueled by the desperation of a man watching his life's work turn to dust. For Cletus, Bobby Ray was not just a neighbor. He was a symbol of everything that was rendering him obsolete. He was a younger, smarter man who was going to survive. And in that moment, Cletus saw him as the author of his own ruin. As the confrontation escalated, Cletus, a man defined by the hard physical tools of his trade, reached for what was familiar. It might have been a heavy wrench left on a tractor, or a rusted piece of iron discarded in the weeds. The air, thick with the drone of cicadas, was suddenly punctuated by a single, sickeningly dull thud. The sound was absolute. The argument stopped. One moment, 2 men were standing in the heat, their voices cracking with rage. The next, only one was left standing. Bobby Ray Henderson fell into the very dirt he had come to inspect, the wire cutters still clenched in his hand, a final futile testament to the truth he had uncovered. The silence that followed was broken only by Cletus Brown's own ragged breathing. Panic gave way to a cold, terrifying practicality bred from a lifetime of solving grim problems on the farm. From the kitchen window of the Brown farmhouse, his wife Martha may have seen a horrifying tableau. Her husband, a dark silhouette against the brutal sun, dragging a heavy, inert shape from the creek bed towards the deep shadows of the main barn. She would not have needed to see more. In that moment, she became a keeper of a secret she was too terrified to ever speak. Inside the barn, the cover-up became a grotesque act of agricultural engineering. Cletus saw the detached tractor wheel, a massive hollow vessel. Over the next hours, in the suffocating heat, he performed his grim task: the scraping of a shovel on the dirt floor, the heavy, measured packing of soil around the body, and finally, the 2 50-pound bags of lime, a white powder that would consume the evidence and seal the secret. He was not just burying a body, he was planting it, hiding a man inside an object so common, so mundane, that it would be ignored for 20 years. The wheel, now a sealed tomb, was left on the floor, another piece of forgotten machinery in a decaying barn. Justice, in this case, would not be found in a courtroom. Its venue was a sterile room in a state-run nursing home, a place that smelled of disinfectant and quiet despair. There, Detective Frank Miller sat opposite an 85-year-old Cletus Brown. The man who had committed a murder and hidden it with such grim ingenuity was now a prisoner of his own decaying mind, his eyes vacant, his connection to the present frayed to a single, fragile thread. Another officer stood by, his presence a quiet, official witness to the final act of a 20-year tragedy. Miller did not raise his voice. He laid out the facts of the case, a calm and methodical recitation of the truth. He spoke of the creek, of the drought, of the earthen dam. Finally, he placed the rusted wire cutters, sealed in an evidence bag, on the small table between them. The metal, corroded by time and soil, was a dark stain against the clean laminate. For a long time, Cletus showed no reaction. Then Miller asked the question, the key that unlocked the last door. He asked about the water. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, the fog in Cletus Brown's eyes burned away. A flicker of the man he once was, hard, possessive and violent, surfaced. His gaze locked onto Miller's with an intensity that had been absent for years. He snarled, the words a low, guttural rasp, but perfectly clear. "He shouldn't have touched my water." It was a confession. It was a motive. It was a final, unrepentant declaration of a pride so deep it had justified murder. Then, as quickly as it came, the light was gone, and he was once again a lost old man in a quiet room. Due to his advanced dementia, Cletus Brown was deemed unfit to stand trial. There would be no jury, no sentencing. The legal system, a machine built for the lucid, could not touch him. His prison was his own skull, his sentence a slow, inexorable slide into nothingness. He died of natural causes 3 months after that final lucid moment, a killer who had outlived his crime, but not his punishment. For the Henderson family, the truth was a brutal gift. The agonizing void of not knowing, which had haunted them for 2 decades, was finally filled. But it was filled with the ugly, senseless reality of a murder over a trickle of water. The relief of a resolution was inseparable from the renewed, acute pain of their loss. Legal justice had been served not by a verdict, but by a quiet confirmation. Yet it was a justice that could not turn back time, could not restore a life, and could not fully heal the wound that a single act of violence had torn through the fabric of their family. Today, there is no Brown farm. The collapsing barn, the rusted equipment, the parched fields, it has all been scraped away. In its place stands a new housing development, a neat grid of suburban homes with manicured lawns and 2-car garages. Children ride bicycles on streets named after trees that were never there. The creek bed, the very source of the conflict that took a man's life, is now an engineered drainage culvert running behind a row of identical vinyl fences. The land has been tamed, paved over, and remade, its violent history buried under a thin layer of sod and fresh paint. The John Deere wheel, the bizarre and grim artifact at the center of this tragedy, no longer exists. After all legal proceedings were concluded, it was taken from the sheriff's evidence locker and, at the request of the Henderson family, it was ceremonially destroyed. It was an object too heavy with memory to be allowed to endure. It was cut into pieces and melted down, its purpose as a makeshift coffin unmade, its existence erased from the physical world, leaving only the story behind. In the end, this was not a mystery solved by a single brilliant deduction, but a truth unearthed by the weight of time. It was a story about a simmering conflict, hidden in plain sight, between the past and the future. A battle over something as fundamental as land and water, fought between a man who looked to the horizon and a man who was trapped by his own history. The secret was not kept by a complex conspiracy, but by the simple, paralyzing fear of a wife and the stubborn, prideful silence of a community that preferred a convenient lie to an ugly truth. The truth did not find its way to the surface gently. It had to be excavated, torn from the earth by the steel teeth of a demolition crew. It proves that a secret, no matter how carefully packed in soil and lime, cannot rest. It radiates. It poisons the ground it's buried in, waiting for the moment the earth is disturbed. Bobby Ray Henderson was hidden not in a remote, unmarked grave, but inside the mundane, right next to the land he died for. And today, in the new development, automatic sprinklers hiss across the perfect green lawns, a sound of effortless abundance. They are watering the very ground where a man was murdered for a trickle of water in a dusty creek bed. The silence that falls when they shut off is absolute. But it is not empty. It holds the weight of 20 years.